All right, thanks everyone for coming out. I know it's pretty awful weather, but hopefully that adds to the mood a little bit, makes it feel a little more like Halloween. So how many of you have heard of yokai in Japanese folklore before? Anybody? Some of you? A few of you? All right. How many of you have heard of Pokemon? All of you? Okay, and how many of you have seen The Ring? A lot of you? Yeah. Okay, so you are familiar with Japanese folklore, even if you don't know it. So I'm here to talk to you a little bit about ghosts, and specifically yokai. Do you guys know this word, yokai? Some of you? How many people know yokai? How many of you have heard the word before? Okay, good. So not totally unfamiliar to you. So yokai are basically it's a catch-all phrase for the supernatural creatures of Japan. So that includes ghosts, monsters. If you've heard words like bakemono or mononoke, things like that, they can all be summed up with the word yokai. So this is the word yokai for you Japanese students. It has two kanji, yo, which means attractive, bewitching, and calamity. It has this connotation of something that's really mysterious but also dangerous for you. And kai, mystery or wonder, it's the same kai in the word kaidan, which means ghost story. So again, it has sort of this mysterious but ominous feeling to it. So the history of yokai goes back as far as the history of Japan. It starts in the ancient times before pre-recorded history. And back then, the word yokai wasn't around, but the concept of the creatures that we call yokai today were. So back then, yokai were things like river spirits, mountain spirits, tree spirits, all of these kami that inhabited the land. And over the centuries, some kami sort of became worshipped as gods, and other kami sort of became forgotten. And those forgotten kami are the ones that turned into monsters and demons and eventually became scary stories to tell your kids. So here's a few examples of what yokai might have looked like back in the prehistoric period. We have gods. In the middle, we have tengu, which are like evil demons, and dragons. During the Heian period, there was a big shift in Japanese culture, and there was also a shift in yokai because of that. In the Heian period, people became really obsessed with ghosts. So if you've ever seen things like The Ring with the creepy long-haired ghosts and the white kimono, that's when these concepts started to appear in the late 700s up through like 1000, 1100. You have these obsession with ghosts. And the reason for that was that natural disasters and plagues and any sort of things like that were blamed on the anger of people's ancestors. So if there was an earthquake, they might think, oh, remember that important person who died recently? He died kind of angry at us because we didn't give him a promotion. So they would posthumously give this person a promotion and elevate them to a special rank, and then the disasters would stop. So this sort of thinking caused kind of a religion of ghosts to spring up in Japan. It was called Goryo Shinko, and it was this religion of ancestor worship and placating angry ghosts. And so a lot of our scary stories and tales come from that. After the Heian period ended and the first shogunate took over, yokai changed a little bit as well. So instead of being about ancestor ghosts, they became about demons and monsters. And so a lot of stories were these warriors going off to kill giant oni, giant demons that were terrorizing. So just like the culture shifted away from this imperial nobility lifestyle to this sort of military aesthetic, the stories about yokai also changed from this ancestor worship into demon slaying. So during the Middle Ages of Japan, we have a lot of stories about heroes going off to slay monsters and that sort of chivalry tales. Also in the later Middle Ages, around the Muromachi period, these picture scrolls started to become very popular. They're called hyakihyago emaki, so they're picture scrolls of 100 demons. And usually they featured really silly images of monsters that were made from household items. So it's a little hard to tell because they're so stylized, but you can see there's like a futon monster, and there's a kettle monster, and there's all these monsters that came at the very end. There's symbols, like finger symbols. So all of these household items sort of took on these anthropomorphic characteristics and became very popular in these illustrations. But at this point, they were still just illustrations. There weren't really stories to go with them. They were just kind of silly pictures. It wasn't until the Edo period that the whole storytelling aspect of yokai became really popular. There was a huge boom. And the reason for that was, one, that Japan was really stable during the Edo period. So an urban culture developed in Tokyo or in Edo. So there was a lot less unrest. There weren't any wars going on, no more civil wars. It was very stable. And things like the printing press and woodblock prints became really cheap and prolific. So a huge publishing industry sprung up in Edo. And because of that, it was possible to make really cheap books. And everyone could get these books. And what was really popular were the same sort of images as before, only now we're seeing huge, colorful books of them being distributed, funny stories being written about them. Some of the stories are really silly. Some of them are borderline pornographic. Some of them are scary as well. And these became very, very popular. These are some of the Edo period drawings of yokai. A lot of times you would see picture encyclopedias. So every page would have a different yokai and its name and maybe a sentence or two about what it does, where it lives. And these were extremely popular. And that was the big Edo period yokai boom. And then, as you know, in 1868, the government changed, the Meiji Restoration happened, and there was a massive movement towards westernization and modernization in Japan. So during the Meiji Restoration, we don't see many yokai stories. The reason for that is that all of these things were viewed as superstitions. So they had Western medicine coming in, Western technology coming in, and so a lot of the people at the top were concerned that ghost stories and superstitions like that were this backwards old Japan, and they wanted to look towards the new westernized Japan, this new industrialized power. So there was a lot of effort to sort of suppress those old superstitions and forget about them and bury them in the past. So for a long period, yokai had gone fairly forgotten until in the post-war period, so at the end of World War II and afterwards in the Reconstruction period, yokai became popular again. And the reason was because of manga. So the most famous yokai manga artist is Mizuki Shigeru. You may or may not have heard of him, but this top illustration here are some of his characters. He based them all on the old yokai books that he had found and old yokai research that he had done. He traveled around collecting stories and illustrating them. And he created this giant yokai industry based on his manga. And he's still a household name today in Japan. If you ask any Japanese person if they know of him, they'll all smile and remember watching the cartoons and reading his books when they were young. And he was sort of it for yokai for a while, until very recently there's been sort of a modern yokai boom since like the early 2000s. So how many of you have seen Inuyasha? Anybody? Pokemon, of course. And just this year in the US, Yokai Watch came out. Has anyone heard of Yokai Watch? A few of you. OK. So these are modern works that are based on yokai. And even though there's a lot of poetic license taken with them, especially with Pokemon, there's a lot of made-up stuff in there. A lot of it is based on folklore, and some of it's directly taken. Especially if you look at Pokemon, you'll see more than half of the Pokemon are just lifted right out of Japanese folklore, rebranded, and sort of given this modern video game touch. But the roots are there, and it's very interesting to look at them and realize that this very modern feeling thing actually stretches back over 1,000 years. So that's like a brief history about yokai. Just to give you a little bit more of a description of what they are. So yokai are creatures that are found in the borderlands. They're not so much like Wolfman or Dracula or Frankenstein where they come right out at you. These are creatures that live in the unknown spaces. So you remember their name means mysterious and bewitching and strange. So it's something that you can't really know 100%. So they live partly between light and shadow. They live partly between night and day. You find a lot of yokai-related things happening during the changing of the seasons. So a lot of legends about yokai take place on the equinoxes or the solstices, and at these sort of transitional periods. They also live at the border of civilization and wilderness. So they don't live way out in the forest, and they don't live right smack in the city, but they live sort of at the edge, the shadowy alleys and the gloomy areas where when you look into them, you can't quite tell if it's a shadow or a person. Those are the areas that you'll find yokai in. And of course, the border between life and death is another big area for ghosts, obviously. So when we categorize yokai, there's many, many groups. And I mean, with something that's lasted for over 1,000 years, you can imagine with each period of history, yokai have changed, new ones have been added. So there's a lot of categories. But we can basically break them into 4 subcategories. And that's oni, or demons, onryo, or vengeful ghosts, kaibutsu and tsukimono, which are sort of the generic monster yokai, and finally Kyyy, which are strange phenomenon. They're not creatures, they're things that happen, but they're also unexplained, and we can still call them yokai. So if we're going to rank these sort of in order of scariness and how terrible these creatures are, the first one is oni. So oni were the creatures, particularly of the shogun period and the samurai periods. They were big demons, your typical image of a demon. They've got red skin, they've got horns, they carry big metal weapons, and they bash people. They live in hell, and they come back to this earth to either kill people or punish people who have escaped from hell. They do all sorts of nasty things. So anything that you can imagine a nasty person doing, that's what an oni does. This is a very famous oni, one of the most famous, and he's often considered the king of the oni. His name was Shootin Doji, which means little alcoholic boy. And the reason he got that name is because when he was young, he was actually a human. He was a very badly behaved boy, and his parents didn't want him, so they sent him off to a monastery to become a monk. And he was a very bad monk. He would play tricks, he wouldn't go to his studies, and he would always just sit around drinking. And one day, there was a festival, and he put on a scary demon mask, and he jumped out to scare a bunch of people. And afterwards, he found out he couldn't take the mask off. It had sort of fused to his skin. So he ran off into the mountains and lived by himself. And gradually over the years, he became more and more evil. He began to attack people, and he transformed into an oni. And he ended up becoming a very famous legend in Japan where Shootin Doji gathered an army of other oni, and they began to assault Kyoto, and they were close to taking down the capital when a band of heroes grouped together and finally went up into the mountains and killed them. So they cut off his head, they buried it outside of Kyoto, and there's a mound out there that still exists today called Onizuka, where you can go, and this is the mound where Shootin Doji's head is buried. There's a small little shrine there, so you can actually visit his gravesite. So there's something interesting about yokai there, where it's fantasy, but there's a real artifact left behind by this monster. So that it's the borderlands between real and imaginary. Oni can be women as well. This is a very famous oni. She's known as the Witch of Togakushi Mountain. Or also her nickname is Momiji, which means fall leaves. She's from a famous no play. And in her story, a samurai is out wandering through the mountains hunting for oni. And he's invited to a very nice picnic up in the mountains. There's a beautiful woman and her court are having a picnic watching the fall leaves. And they invite this samurai and his retainer to come and have wine with them. So they drink with the girls. The girls perform a little dance, and it sort of hypnotizes them and puts them to sleep. And he has this dream that his god comes to him and tells him, "Wake up, there's a demon nearby," and gives him a sword. So when he wakes up, he finds out the sword is actually in his hand. And the woman who he thought was this beautiful princess is actually an oni, and she's grown horns, and she's set the forest on fire, and she's trying to kill him. And they have a very, very big battle, and finally he defeats her. And all of that is told in a very famous no play as well. So for a long time, Oni were ranked as the scariest yokai in Japan, but a very close second scariness are onryo. And these are things like Sadako from The Ring, or if you've seen The Grudge, the ghost in that. All of these scary ghosts that come back to haunt you, and they don't stop. Even after you do what you think it is to appease them, they don't stop. And probably the most famous onryo was actually the Emperor of Japan. Emperor Sutoku, who ruled in the Heian period, sort of towards the end, he got involved in a civil war, and he ended up losing. And so he was deposed and replaced by another emperor. But they couldn't just kill him or anything like that. There was a lot of politics involved. So they ended up sending him off to an island. And he could live a nice, comfortable island in exile. And there he still wanted to help the country. So he did his best work to write down and copy down Buddhist sutras and scrolls for the nobility. And he sent them all back to Kyoto. But there was a rumor that he harbored this grudge. And he actually was writing the scrolls in his own blood. So he was cutting his arms, collecting the blood, and writing all of these stories and sending them back as a curse. So the nobility in Kyoto decided they would just burn everything he sent them. So he had spent a long time copying scrolls down to have them all burned. And so the legend is that he bit his own tongue off while writing scrolls, bled to death, and then turned into a terrible ghost. And shortly after he died, lightning struck the palace in Kyoto. There was an earthquake, there were plagues, and all of a sudden people realized that this must be Emperor Sutoku's ghost come back to haunt us. So a lot of work was put into restoring his works, building a shrine for him, enshrining him as a deity. But he's also, he's one of many of these sort of nobility onryo that come back to haunt Japan, and he's the most famous of them. This is just a typical image of a ghost in Japanese folklore. They usually wear burial kimonos. They have hands that hang loose at the wrists, and they don't have feet. They just fade away at the end. So this is a little bit more of a peaceful image of a ghost, but again, these are sort of the second most scary creatures in Japanese folklore. Next, we have kaibutsu, or tsukimono. These are this is the catch-all group. This is the much, much larger group than all of the others. And the reason is because there's just so many. So if you think about how many Pokemon there are, hundreds and hundreds, well, there's even more yokai. And most of them fit into this group. So to give you one example, this is called a Nue. It's part monkey, part tiger, part snake, part bird. And the story of the Nue is that in Kyoto, there was a big storm, and the emperor became very sick and began having these fever dreams. And he dreamed that there was an evil monster lurking in the clouds above the palace. So that night, the palace was struck by lightning, and so the emperor called out his best archers. And they looked up into the sky, and they saw this creature up there. And so the best archer grabbed his bow, shot the creature, and this thing fell out of the sky with an arrow through it. They weren't sure what it was. They called it the Nue. It was this weird monster. And they had no idea what to do with it. Should they burn it? Should they bury it? So they decided it wasn't their problem. They put the corpse on a boat and sent it down the river to the ocean. Later on, in a village some miles away, the boat washed to shore. And the people in there saw this shot monster in the boat, and they also had no idea what to do. So they took it out, and they built a grave for it and buried it. And I think that's a few miles outside of Osaka that you can go visit the Nuezuka, the burial mound of this famous creature. This is another example of a kaibutsu. This is a creature called tenome, which means eye hands. So it's just as it looks like he's got eyes on his hands. And there aren't too many stories about him. I think he's more of just a creature that was invented by some artist during the Edo period. So remember how I said there was a big publishing boom in the Edo period? During that time, a lot of yokai were just made up to sell books. So a lot of artists, they would go around collecting folk tales, but sometimes they just decided, I need more pages, and they just drew some silly pictures, threw him in there, gave him a name, and called it a yokai. And this is an example of one of those. Much later on, some stories were written about him, but he wasn't originally something from folklore. He was originally something from an artist's imagination, which later became folklore. And tsukimono basically means possessions. They're possessed creatures, possessed people, possessed animals, all sorts of things that can possess you. For example, those household tools we talked about earlier, those are all an example of tsukimono. This is an example called an inugami. It's a dog spirit. And these were instruments of black magic used by people, especially in Kyushu, but also around Okayama and Kyoto and Western Japan. And the way to create one of these, you would chain a dog up until it was nearly starving. And then while the dog was desperate for food, you would put some food in front of it, just out of its reach. So it would be pulling on its chain. And as it's freaking out trying to get the food, you would chop its head off. And you would take that head, and then you would bury it in a crossroads or an intersection. So it would have hundreds of people walking on top of it every day. And this was supposed to make the spirit more and more angry and more filled with hatred and vengeance. And after some time, you would take the skull out of the ground, and you would put it in a bowl of blood and other things, and you would hide this bowl under your bed. And then from then on, you could summon the dog's ghost. And it would sort of become a family spirit, and you could use this inugami. He could possess people, he could enter their bodies and make them do things. He could ruin tools, so somebody's industry would be destroyed. He could ruin crops, do all sorts of really nasty things. And so these were tools of black magic that a lot of families used against each other in Japan. And even though that sounds so fantastic to us, something actually happened, because not only did people believe in this widespread, but there were laws written that made this practice illegal. So what actually happened is unknown, but there was something believable enough that people thought these families owned these dog spirits that were able to curse them. This is a close-up example of one of those artifact spirits. They're called Tsukumogami. This is a broom spirit. And they don't usually have much of a story behind them. They're usually based on silly illustrations. But the description of this character is that it's a broom that hasn't been used in a long time. Maybe it's been replaced by a new broom. So it just sits there in the closet collecting dust. And gradually it grows resentful. And so in the night, it wakes up and starts sweeping like crazy, running out into the street and having a good time sweeping everything. And then in the morning, you wake up and you find your old broom out in the yard somewhere mysteriously, and you don't know how it got there. Well, it's probably because it's possessed by a spirit. So those are just a few examples of the kaibutsu and tsukimono genre of yokai, but that's by far the biggest group. There are hundreds and hundreds of examples there. The final group is called Kyyy, and these are strange phenomena. So they're not actual creatures. This is an example called Ryuto, which means dragon lights. This is a very specific yokai to bodies of water, especially bodies of water near shrines. As you can see, it looks like a dragon, and the story behind this is that these are the lanterns of the dragon god who lives beneath the sea. So according to Japanese legend, the bottom of the sea has this dragon god named Ryujin, who lives down there in a coral palace, and he controls the tides, and he's the master of all the sea. So at nighttime, he'll send up these lanterns that float on the water, and at certain parts you can see them. They're kind of like mirages, but all around Japan, they say if you look out far into the ocean, you can see these lanterns floating around. So this specific example takes place at Miyajima Island, if you guys know that place. Have you ever seen the famous photo of the torii that's out at sea with the water beneath it? Probably in every guidebook to Japan, you've seen that photo. So this yokai lives there, and he comes out on New Year's Day, and it looks just like this. It starts as a ball of fire that floats up out of the water, and then a few more join it, and they all join together. They dance around for a little while in the shape of a dragon, and then they sink back below the sea. So they say that on New Year's Day, a lot of people gather at Miyajima to watch the Ryuto fly out of the water. I was there on the day before New Year's, so I wasn't actually able to see it. So I missed it by like a day, but that's a very famous yokai. They're also scary, Kyyy as well. This is called kanashibari, which literally means bound up with iron. But this is a phenomenon that happens to people when they're sleeping and they wake up but their body can't move. Has that ever happened to anybody here? Sleep paralysis, right? So it's kind of a well-documented thing nowadays. We all have heard of sleep paralysis. But in Japanese folklore, the idea of kanashibari was that a ghost had crawled up out of the ground and was sitting on your chest. And it felt like you were bound up with iron, which is why they called it kanashibari. The idea is you can't move because something is cursing you. And of course, nowadays with sleep paralysis, a lot of people say that they can see some sort of ghostly or demonic figure in the room. And that's explained with psychological reasoning, but you can imagine what it would have been like for people 100 years ago or 200 years ago who didn't have any sort of psychology or medicine studies to experience that feeling. It would be pretty terrifying. So Kyyy is also used to describe things like mental illness, strange sounds in the night. All sorts of phenomenon that are unexplainable can also be grouped into yokai. Diseases used to be thought to be caused by yokai as well, before people knew about bacteria and viruses. So the world of yokai is very, very broad and has a lot of things in it. Next, I'm going to tell you a couple yokai stories. But before we continue, since that's sort of been a lot of information to digest, does anyone have any questions? No? Everyone's OK following me so far? OK. So I'm going to tell you a few short yokai stories. Most Japanese folktales are really, really short. They're not like Grimm's fairy tales that can be pages or even books long. They're usually 1 or 2 paragraphs. Some of them are even just 1 or 2 sentences long. They're very, very short, and they're meant to be told in succession, a lot of them one after another at these sort of ghost storytelling parties. So I've picked a few of the longer ones to tell you. I hope you find them interesting. So this first one is called Dojoji. It was turned into a famous No play. It's a local legend from near Kyoto in Wakayama prefectures. Long ago, during the reign of Emperor Daigo, a young priest named Anshin was traveling from Mutsu to Kumano on a pilgrimage. Every year he made the journey, and every year he would lodge at the manor of Masago no Shoji. He was an incredibly good-looking young man, and he caught the eye of Kiyohime, the manor lord's daughter. She was a troublesome young girl. Anshin joked to her that if she were a good girl and behaved herself, he would marry her one day and take her back to Mutsu with him. Every year, Kiyohime waited for Anshin to come again on his pilgrimage. When she came of age, she reminded him of his promise and asked him to marry her. Anshin, embarrassed that she had taken his word seriously, lied to her and said he would come back for her as soon as he finished his pilgrimage. On his return, however, he avoided the Masago no Shoji manor, and he headed straight for Mutsu. When Kiyohime heard of Anshin's deception, she was overcome with grief. She ran after the young priest, barefoot, determined to marry him. Anshin fled as fast as he could, but Kiyohime caught him on the road to the temple Dojoji. There, instead of greeting her, Anshin lied again. He pretended not to know her and protested that he was late for a meeting somewhere else. Kiyohime's sadness turned into furious rage. She attacked, moving forward to punish that lying priest. Anshin prayed to Kumano Gongen to save him. Suddenly, a divine light dazzled Kiyohime's eyes and paralyzed her body, giving Anshin just enough time to escape. Kiyohime's rage exploded. The divine intervention had pushed her over the edge. She transformed into a giant fire-breathing serpent. When Anshin reached the Hiraka River, he paid the boatman and begged him not to allow anyone else to cross. Then he ran to Dojoji for safety. Ignoring the boatman entirely, Kiyohime swam across the river after Anshin, and that's where this illustration comes from. Seeing the monstrous serpent, the priests of Dojoji hid Anshin inside of the large bronze temple bell. However, Kiyohime could smell Anshin inside. Overcome with rage and despair, she wrapped herself around the bell and breathed fire on it until it became white hot. She roasted Anshin alive inside the bell. After he died, the demon Kiyohime threw herself into the river and drowned. And that's the end of that story. So that's kind of like a Japanese tragedy, sort of a Japanese Romeo and Juliet, I guess you could say, but a little more scary. So that was turned into a very famous no play, and it has a lot of sort of Buddhist morality tales tied into it, but the original story was much shorter, and that was basically what it was, just a short little oral tale like that. And so she's an example of an oni, one of the yokai we looked at earlier. Next, we have Gagoze. This is an example of an onryo. As you can see, he's kind of creepy, crawling out of the shrine there. There's an ancient temple in Nara Prefecture called Gangoji, which had a famous haunting back in the Asuka period, almost 1,500 years ago. During the time of Emperor Bidatsu, in Owari province, during a strange thunderstorm, a bolt of lightning struck the ground near a farmer's house. From the bolt of lightning emerged a tiny thunder spirit in the form of a young boy. The terrified farmer ran outside with a stick to kill the creature, but the spirit pleaded with the farmer to spare his life in return for a gift. The farmer and his wife had no son, so the thunder spirit offered to give them a young son as strong as a god. The farmer agreed, and the thunder spirit returned to the sky. Sure enough, the farmer's wife soon bore a child, and the child was as strong as a god. As he grew, the boy's reputation spread, and when the boy turned 10, he had grown so strong and proud that he challenged a member of the imperial family to a contest of strength, and won. The emperor decided that the boy's strength was too great a gift to be left for a mere farmer, and so he was apprenticed to Gangoji Temple to become a priest. Gangoji had been suffering from an unknown horror. The bell tower boys had begun dying very strange deaths, one by one, and rumors began to spread that some kind of demon was behind the deaths. The boy thought that he might use his strength to solve the mystery, so he said that he would be used as bait, and they could use him to catch the demon. He waited all night by the bell tower, and towards dawn, finally, an unholy presence could be felt. A ghostly demon appeared and rushed to attack the boy, but he was ready for it. The boy grabbed the oni by the hair and dragged him all around the temple grounds, beating him as he did. He dragged the demon so hard that he ripped the creature's entire scalp off its head, and the demon was able to escape. The next morning, the boy presented the scalp of the ghost to the temple as proof that he had destroyed it. The priests followed the bloody trail left by the fleeing creature all the way to its end, where they found the grave of a temple servant who was very lazy and sinful. The lazy servant's ghost had transformed into a terrible ghost demon, and this young boy had defeated it. After that, the boy became famous all around, and he grew up to be a priest as well as the lead martial arts instructor at the temple. The demon's scalp became one of the holy treasures of Gangoji and is still used today to plow the temple's fields. So there's another example of yokai blurring the line of reality and fiction. Here's this story that's totally fantastical and happened long ago, but apparently, if you go to Gangoji Temple, they still have this demon scalp, and they will display it on certain days of the year, but most of the time it's kept locked up. But apparently this scalp is so strong that they can use it to plow fields. I don't know how, but there's an interesting just question of where the line of fact and fiction ends there. Is there actually a scalp? Is it actually a demon's scalp? Who knows? So this is Tenome. I told you about him before. He was originally created with just an illustration, but much later, some scary stories were written about him. So he's sort of developed backwards in the opposite way that most creatures are created. And he's an example of a kaibutsu, so he's a strange monster. Long ago, in the Shichijo district of Kyoto, a young man was challenged to a test of bravery by his friends. They dared him to spend the night in a nearby graveyard, which was overgrown and undertended. The young man couldn't look like a coward, and so he agreed. As the sun went down, he entered the eerie, run-down graveyard. It wasn't long before his eyes started playing tricks on him and made him see things standing amongst the graves in the tall grass. As he waited in the darkness, he saw a figure nearby. It looked like an old blind beggar stumbling quickly towards the young man. When the beggar was close enough to be seen in detail, the young man saw that it was not a man. It was a creature with eyeballs on the palms of its hands, and it was coming straight at him. The young man ran as fast as he could to a nearby temple and told the priest in a panic that he had seen a bakemono. The priest told the young man that only a few days ago, a blind man had been begging near the graveyard when some bandits came and stabbed him to death, taking what little money he had. The priest discovered the dying man, and with his last breath, the beggar wished, "If only I had working eyes, even if they were on the palms of my hands. I could have identified my killers and avenged my death." Every night since then, this tenome would appear in the graveyard where the beggar died, hunting for its killers. The young man begged the priest to hide him until the tenome passed. The priest cleared out an oversized storage chest and told the young man to get in. The priest locked the lid of the chest and hid himself in another room. Not long after that, the sound of the temple doors sliding open could be heard. Shook. Then a heavy footstep, as the monster entered the temple, accompanied by a loud sniffing sound, like a wild animal hunting for food. The sniffing noise drew closer and closer to the oversized chest until it stopped right next to it. Then there was a strange slurping sound, like a hungry dog sucking on the animal's bones. Then the sound suddenly stopped, and all was quiet again. The priest ran over to unlock the chest and let the young man out. "The tenome is gone. You're safe now." When he opened the lid, the priest was horrified. All that was inside was the empty, boneless skin of the young man. The end. So that's the tenome. A lot creepier than he originally looked. And this is another example, or this is an example of a Kyyy, one of those strange phenomenon. This is called oitekebori, which means it's sort of a local slang for drop it and get out of here. And bori means canal. So this is the drop it and get out of here canal. It's about a story that happened at a canal in Edo. The neighborhood of Tokyo, known as Honjo, is full of canals and waterways, which crisscross the city, following the paths of what used to be the natural streams and rivers. In the old days, these canals were teeming with fish and wildlife. It was possible for the locals to make a decent living catching and selling the fish that were caught in the town's network of canals and aqueducts. One night, long, long ago, 2 fishermen were fishing in the canals of Honjo at sunset. They noticed that in one particular spot, they were catching many more fish than usual. And so they stayed there and fished, filling their fish baskets until they could hold no more. The fishermen happily packed up their rods and tackle and prepared to carry their large catches home. Just as they were about to leave, however, they heard an eerie, terrible voice coming from the canal. "Oiteke." The fishermen looked at one another, not sure whether to believe what they had both heard. Before they had time to question what it was, they heard it again. "Oiteke." What happens next depends on who is telling the story. Some say that both fishermen dropped their baskets and fled, and then when they returned later that night, both baskets were empty. Others say that they fled home with their baskets, but when they got home and looked inside, there wasn't even a minnow left in the baskets. But the most chilling version goes like this. The fisherman turned and fled from the canal in a panic. The older fisherman dropped his basket of fish into the water and ran all the way back to his home and bolted his door shut. The younger fisherman, however, didn't drop his basket and couldn't run very fast under the weight of all the extra fish he was carried. He ran along the canal towards his house, but as he did, a ghostly hand rose up out of the water and pulled him in, basket and all, dragging him beneath the surface. He was never seen again. The end. So there's an example of a Kyyy and a very typical Japanese ghost story, just a few paragraphs long. These were really popular during the Edo period, especially during the summer months, because people would gather in their house and they would have a ghost storytelling party. They would light 100 candles, and every person would take a turn telling one short story like that, and they would extinguish one candle after each ghost story. And by the end of the night, the rumor was that when you threw out that last candle, a real ghost would appear. So most of these parties ended at 99 stories, and people would go home. So I was researching these short stories in Japan and collecting them, and these are the two books that I wrote. The first one I wrote while I was in Japan, and the second one I finished here in the US. But they're full of yokai and ghost stories, just like the ones that you just saw. So if you're interested, please come up and take a look.